Today, we're talking about Ezra. This is going to be class 4. We are going to pick up in chapter 6, verse 1 of the book of Ezra. To give you a small reminder of what this book is about, most of the major and minor prophets talk about the downfall of Israel, the backsliding of Israel, and how they're still worshiping idols, and that they're not really worshiping God correctly, and their heart's not in the right spot. And if things don't change, then they're going to be taken away by a foreign empire or a nation. They were really concerned about Egypt for a while. That wasn't the threat. The real threat, of course, was Assyria, and then Babylon, and the Medo-Persian Empire. Excuse me, I got a frog in my throat still. So that's the real threat. And they were, in fact, did not repent, did not change their ways, and they were taken away captive for 70 years. Before they left, you had the walls of Israel fall, and you had the temple of God in Jerusalem fall and be destroyed for the first time. And then, so 70 years later, the book of Ezra recounts in a historical way how the Jews that were taken away captive were allowed by King Cyrus of Persia to get up all their stuff together, get all the vessels of gold from the temple that they took originally, and then to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Long story short, they get down there, things aren't good for a while, they start building, things are going well. You have a group of people who are not really Jewish, but they know the Jewish God, and they want to help the Jews build the temple. But they say, no, you're not real pure Jews, so you can't do that. They get mad about it, and they start sending hate mail to the Persian Empire on behalf of the Jews, saying that they don't have the right to build and trying to stop them every which way. The latest drama or saga of that kind of spiel is you have this group of people who are living in the land, and they send a letter to King Darius. Right, looks like Darius. Looks King Darius, and they say, look, they are beginning to rebuild your temple. We're not sure they have the authority that King Cyrus said that they had. Maybe you should look in the record room and see what Cyrus actually said, because if they rebuild this temple, they're going to rebel against you. You can't control them. They're not going to give you taxes or tributes like any good beaten up nation would do. So maybe you should look into it. And so King Darius basically looks into it. But before we go into the rest of this, I think it's important that we kind of remember the zeal that was lost, and then the zeal that was refound by the two guys who are basically the governors of Jerusalem. So let's jump back here into chapter 5. So it's going to take a little bit longer than I wanted to do, but if we're going to do it, we might as well do it right. I mean, that's kind of the way, right? So if we look over chapter 5, okay, chapter 5, verse 1. Now the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem. So Judah being the region of the south, and Jerusalem being the main city, right? So just kind of a large picture, small picture. In the name of God of Israel, who is over them. So you have the prophets speaking up now, and they are giving direct revelation from their inspiration about what the people are to be doing when they rebuild the temple. Then Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Jeshua, the son of Jozadak, the two guys that are really governors, right? They arose and began to rebuild the house of God that's in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, supporting them. And then you have these bad guys, right, show up, and they say, oh, they're rebuilding the temple again? What? We thought we stopped that. And so then they write that letter to Darius, beginning in verse 6. So I'm not going to reread the whole thing, but what I want to do is I want to try to figure out, because the answer is really, really easy, what changed their minds about kind of halting the progress on the temple for a while, and then all of a sudden you got Haggai and Zechariah talking to them, and they say, well, you know what? Forget the enemies, whatever they say, we are going to go and rebuild the temple despite the adversaries that we have in the land. So what happened? Well, the answer is super, super easy. The answer lies in a copy of the book or the scroll of Haggai. So we're going to hold our place here. And we're going to push some buttons on the screen. And we're going to go to the book of Haggai, not Haggai. Haggai is the third to last book of the Old Testament, called the Minor Prophets. And we're going to look at this just for a little bit. It's 2 chapters, can't be that bad, right? So we're going to read this real quick and kind of get some context. Again, this is the largest this font will go. I even chopped myself down a little bit, so if you can't read what's on the screen or on the phone or the tablet or whatever you're watching this thing on, grab a copy of the book of Haggai and let's read together, and you'll see how the blanks of Ezra get filled in with the books of Haggai and Zechariah. So here we go. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, so here's the new king that took up basically after Cyrus of the Medo-Persian Empire, right? Cyrus was the first main guy. He sent Ezra and his friends back down to Jerusalem with all the stuff. And so you have Darius, who's now king. So this is kind of what fills in the gaps for us from the history of Ezra. Okay. On the 1st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Jeshua, or Joshua, same guy, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. So you've got the high priest son, basically, and then you've got the main governor, and Haggai is going by the word of the Lord, so through inspiration, to go tell this guy something they need to know. Okay, verse 2. Thus says the Lord of hosts, these people say the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. So what's his message from God? He's like, y'all are walking around saying it's not yet time to rebuild the temple. Now, historically, that's going to be true because they had a bunch of adversaries and enemies that were around them, and they were causing all kinds of problems, and they were threatening the people physically. And so you've got the people now in the mindset that came out of captivity saying, we're here, let's just kind of stay here for a bit until things calm down, and then we'll kind of get back to what we're here to do, to rebuild the temple. Then the word of the Lord came by the hand of Haggai the prophet. Is it a time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses while this house lies in ruins? So it seems like God says what they were doing was not right, because they live in paneled homes, which is kind of a foreign concept to us. But in our modern equivalent, think about you working really hard on your house. You've got the foundation laid, the pipes that are there, you've got the walls that are up, and you're starting to get the drywall on there and the sheetrock's being done. Get all the mud drying off, and then you're beginning to paint your own home and then put the siding on and the roofs on, and everyone's focused on that, their own personal homes. That's kind of an equivalent to what we're saying here. He's saying, you guys are fixing up your own homes to a level to where they're done, they're completed. And yet the house of God that you came here to build, you've stopped working on it. You kind of lost your priorities here. Now, therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways, which is, one of those phrases that you can just stop in and just write a whole sermon or just think about an entire area of study around that concept of consider your ways, meaning stop for a moment what you're doing and just think about what's happening. Is this appropriate? Is it the right time? Is it inappropriate or sinful? Is it, a thing that should not be done? Should you focus so much on your own stuff that the stuff of God gets neglected? That's kind of a broad stroke, but that's the concept. You have sown much, meaning when it came time for you to plant seed for the harvest, you put a lot of seed out there, and yet you harvested little. Now, this is a small little twinge, right? He's saying God is even using how little you got from this year's harvest to be a little, kick to get you to be thinking about, is everything that we're doing right? Because we're not being as blessed as much as we could be. Could this be a result of our inaction to work on the stuff of God? That's a huge conversation in and of itself, right? You eat, but you never have enough. You drink, but you never have your fill. You clothe yourselves, but no one is warm. And he who earns wages does so to put them in a bag with holes. So we've gone beyond just the metaphorical kind of harvest situation here, and now we're going on to a conversation about the tendency of mankind to work and to strive and to toil and to labor for things that are never really going to satisfy or ever reach an end, right? Thus says the Lord of hosts, consider your ways. Go up to the hills and bring wood and build the house that I may take pleasure in it and I may be glorified, says the Lord. You looked for much, and behold, it became too little. And when you brought it home, I blew it away. Why, declares the Lord of hosts? Because my house that lies in ruins, while each of you busies himself with his own house. That was the message from Haggai, was that they were so busy on their own homes that they neglected the work that they were there to do in the first place. Now, for application, just simplistically, I mean, you can be as broad as you want, I suppose, because you're doing it, not me. But if I might suggest an application for this, don't we sometimes have the same problem? That we get caught up in the daily necessities that we have to provide for, and we think that we do it ourselves by our own power, right? And in some way we contribute, but ultimately God blesses us with what we have every day. But if we get caught up in the day-to-day, then it's easy for us to kind of forget about the most important thing, which is the spiritual, and to spread the gospel and to keep up the needs of God. And, you know, as someone who has spent his fair share, anyway, my point is pretty obvious. If we jump back into our context here of Ezra, now you kind of have an idea that when we pick it up in chapter 5, and then you have Jeshua and you have Shealtiel, and they are all fired up to get back to the temple and get back to work no matter what the enemies say. Now you kind of know why, right? Because you got a prophet of God speaking on behalf of God saying, God's not happy with you. He's not going to bless you. Yeah, you're in the right place, but you're not doing the right thing. You're at the wrong priority. So that kind of gives us some more flavor, some more context, some more depth to the idea of what we're reading here in Ezra. And it's important to kind of know that, I think. It's important for me to know that, first of all, because it kind of gives you the character of what we're talking about. But also, if you don't stop every now and again and try to figure out some more layers, you can really get into a habit of just rolling through these historical books and just say, yeah, that's good. That's all well and good. Now I know the information, but you forget kind of why, and then you forget the application and why it's kind of there in the first place. So anyway, keep that in mind as you do your own personal study. It may be helpful to kind of stop and just consider your ways, right? To think about why we're reading what we're reading. Okay, so let's jump back to chapter 6, verse 1. Here's Darius. He got that letter from the bad guys, and bad guys said, we don't think they had the right. You might want to double check what Cyrus said about it. And so here's what Darius says. Then Darius, the king, made a decree, and search was made in Babylonia, in the house of the archives where the documents were stored. Now, generation after generation of archaeologists and scholars would just love more information about where this was for certain. They have theories. And then what happened to it all, besides the assumption that time wasted it away or a great fire destroyed all the scrolls that were there. It's just, we don't need it, obviously, when it comes to information, but the more depth that you can get from research, the more the information upon which we place our faith is verified, meaning the more stuff we dig up, the more it confirms what the Bible has to say, confirming that not only the physical information that we read is true, but also the spiritual information is true. And that's helpful, obviously, because we don't want to have a blind, trusting faith in wrong information. We need to have faith, absolutely. We don't have to have every single thing verified, but it just kind of gives us the information that we're making an educated decision and trusting our eternal salvation with a book when there are other options out there. If you've not considered that thought before, then let that kind of cogitate for a bit and think what you think. In verse 2, and Ecbatana, the citadel, or the castle that was in the province of Media, a scroll was found on which this was written, a record. In the first year of Cyrus the king issued a decree concerning the house of God at Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, the place where sacrifices were offered, and let its foundations be retained. The height shall be 60 cubits, and its breadth 60 cubits, with 3 layers of great stones and 1 layer of timber. Let the cost be paid from the royal treasury. So that's pretty good. It's kind of grant money, right? And also let the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar took out of the temple that's in Jerusalem and brought to Babylon, be restored and brought back to the temple that's in Jerusalem, each to its place. You shall put them in the house of God. Let's pause. So basically they found it. They found evidence that, yes, Cyrus was the guy that issued this decree in the law of the Medes and the Persians. That might be a phrase that you remember from the book of just Esther. There we go. I was going to say Judith. That's the wrong book. Not even part of the Bible. The book of Esther. When something is written in the law of the Medes and the Persians, like this particularly is, it's unmutable, unchangeable, right? You can add additions to it, but you can't really change it. So that's why this is so important. Verse 7, let the work on this house of God alone, let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild the house of God on its site. Moreover, I make a decree regarding whatever you shall do to the elders, for these elders of the Jews, for the rebuilding of the temple of the house of God. The cost is to be paid to these men in full and without delay from the royal revenue, the tribute of the province from beyond the river, and whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep for burnt offerings to the God of heaven, wheat, salt, wine, or oil, as the priests of Jerusalem require, let that be given to them day by day without fail, that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons. And also, I make a decree that if anyone alters this edict, a beam shall be pulled out of his house, he shall be impaled on it, and his house shall be made a dunghill. So, you don't want to change it, or else that's going to happen to you. Doesn't sound like fun. Verse 12, may the God who caused his name to dwell there overthrow any king or people who shall put out a hand to alter this or to destroy the house of God that's in Jerusalem. I, Darius, make a decree. Let it be done with all diligence. So he kind of follows up the letter by saying, yep, I'm not going to alter this. Yep, there it is. Now, let's pause for a second and think about the question, why? Why would a Medo-Persian king who just conquered the Babylonian kingdom, who swallowed up the Assyrian kingdom, want the Jews to be paid to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, this temple of God, pay for it with their own money of the treasury, and then to even offer the animals on the altar? Well, it's a couple of reasons. I don't know them all, but I know a couple of them, I think. One reason might be, and this is speculation, might be that Cyrus saw himself in the scroll of Jeremiah and felt like God chose him, which is what Jeremiah said, that he would have a servant, an anointed one named Cyrus, who was going to send the people back. So maybe he saw that and said, you know what, I'm that guy. He knew about me before I was born, or at least before I became a king. This God is correct. Among all the other gods out there, I know this God's there. That could be true. It could be that his devotion to Jehovah God went a bit further. We don't have any evidence of that, but it could be that he actually had somewhat of a relationship with Jehovah God through the prophets. That's interesting to think about. But practically, why would this emperor, this king, send these Jews back? Well, think about how crazy the Assyrians were, right? I've talked in great length before about how bad and brutal and wicked the Assyrian Empire was. They're famous for how cruel they were to the nations that they conquered. I'm not going to go into that detail now, but just keep that in mind. The Babylonians, they were a little bit different, right? It's a different kingdom, a different kind of empire. They were not as harsh, but they were by no means pushovers, right? Babylonians, that's pretty hardcore stuff too, but not as crazy historically as the Assyrians. You get to the Medo-Persian Empire, and yeah, there's some crazy going on, and it's brutal sometimes, but overall, things are kind of panning out because you can only rule a kingdom that's ruled by fear of terror for so long. And so by the time the Medo-Persian Empire kind of falls by the wayside, you've got this guy named Alexander, right? He's from Macedonia. He's taught by a philosopher we've all heard about. And he comes along, and what he does is instead of destroys and burns, and he does some of that, but instead of that being the primary thing, he establishes the polis, or a city, and he has Alexandria all over the world based on his name. And so you've got these little cities that he goes in. He builds them gymnasiums, gymnasios, where they learn things, education for the men. They also learn, of course, wrestling, which of course is where we get gymnasium from in our English language today. And so you've got a place of education and learning where the people are treated not as subjects, but as more like citizens that we appreciate today, right? And then later on, you've got Rome coming in, and a similar kind of thing. You've got slavery, absolutely, but you've got educated slaves who are useful to their owners, useful to the community, useful to the empire because they're able to do services. And so that kind of gradually shifts. So anyway, my point is, if you look at how these kingdoms treated one another, especially in regards to religion, I can understand why Cyrus and Darius and why all the other kings, Artaxerxes and Xerxes, they are allowing the Jews to go back home to make them happy. They can worship the God they want to make them happy, because when they're happy, they don't rebel as much. They pay their taxes, and they're thankful that they have some oversight in some way when it comes to a government, because they have more money coming in that way to support the things that they want. So that could be the more pragmatic reason as well. I think I've talked enough about that. Let's keep going. Verse 13. Then, according to the word sent by Darius the king, Tattenai, the governor of the province beyond the river, Shelthar-Boznai and their associates did with all diligence what Darius the king had ordered. So the enemies that were unsure about whether or not they could rebuild the temple, they're now helpful. The elders of the Jews built and prospered through the prophesying of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the son of Iddo. They finished their building by decree of God of Israel, by the decree of Cyrus and Darius and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. Artaxerxes, by the way, is Xerxes, the same guy from Esther. So there you go. And this house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar, the Jewish calendar, and the 6th year of the reign of Darius the king. So it took a while, right? If you go back to Haggai and look at the date there, the very first year. So it took 5 years basically to complete the temple from where it was. The people of Israel, the priests and the Levites and the rest of the returned exiles celebrated the dedication of this house of God with joy. They offered at the dedication of the house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and a sin offering, and as a sin offering for all Israel, 12 male goats, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. And they set the priests in their divisions and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. It's been a long time coming, but now the temple's done. It has been dedicated or cleansed, if you will, set apart for the holy purpose of God. And then verse 19. On the 14th day of the first month, the returned exiles kept the Passover. Well, finally, because the priests and the Levites had purified themselves together, all of them were clean. They slaughtered the Passover lamb for all the returned exiles, for their fellow priests and for themselves. This is as required. Hang on. What happened? Okay, verse 21. It was eaten by the people of Israel who had returned from exile, and also by every one who had joined them, and separated himself from the uncleanness of the people of the land, so the Samaritans, to worship the Lord, the God of Israel. They kept the feast of the unleavened bread 7 days with joy, for the Lord has made them joyful, and turned the heart of the king of Assyria to them. So if you're going down the line here, so that he aided them in the work of the house of God, the God of Israel. So it's done. You got the people, they're back in the land, they get distracted for a while, they get back to work, they finish the temple, they dedicate themselves, they keep the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Everything is good again. Long time coming. Generation after generation after generation, and going down the line of people were letting these things slip from being on their radar and being important to them. And now they finally come back from exile and they're all together again. That's great. So we're going to pause here for the day. You have Ezra finally being talked about here in chapter 7. The book bears his name for good reason, but here's what he does. He's a teacher of the people, right? He's a preacher, if you will. So he's going to use the book of the law to do so. So we'll pause here for today. Thank you for your time and your attention. I know there's going to be folks that will watch this afterwards. Appreciate you guys. We're looking forward to a time we can gather again together in person, where this is going to be, a Wednesday night study, like the good old days of all 2-3 months ago, whatever it was. So thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you guys on Sunday and then next week.